Hello everyone, it's Dave Breithauer, and in today's lesson we're going to make a paper rose topiary. Our first step is to assemble the materials. We're going to be using 3 different dies today: the small pinwheel posy, the scalloped posy, and the regular pinwheel posy. We'll be using these 3 different sizes of flowers to create all the blooms that are going to go on our topiary today. Here's the pinwheel posy. Here's the scalloped posy. You can see the ruffled edges. And here's the small pinwheel posy. I think it's important to use a variety of sizes to make your project look a little more interesting. We're going to begin by die cutting the roses, and I'm going to use the regular size pinwheel posy die on some cherry blossom cardstock. I'll run it through and then shift the die to another portion of the cardstock and run it through again. I won't bother with taking the die cut piece out each time, just keep running it through and finding a different area to put the die on. Once you've filled your cardstock with as many shapes as you can cut out, then you can pull things off. For example, I was able to fit 3 different pinwheel posies on this piece of cardstock before pulling everything off the plate. Set these pieces aside and continue the die cutting process. And just as I recommend that you use different size shapes to cut out the flowers, you might want to try different colors as well. Now back to the die cut machine, I'm going to use the scalloped posy, run that through the machine, and start cutting out some scalloped posy shapes. The scalloped posy has a ruffled edge, so it's a little bit more intricate than the other die. If the paper gets stuck inside the die, use a piece of Scotch tape to lift it out. This little trick will save you from having to push things out with a push pin or a thumbtack. Continue to die cut out as many shapes as you can on that single piece of cardstock. You'll want to cut out as many shapes as you possibly can. For this project, I cut out 100 roses. We now need to prepare the trunk portion of the topiary. I think it's fun to add a natural element to this project, so I went to my backyard and trimmed a branch off one of our lilac bushes. I'm going to use some secateurs to make one end of the branch sharp so that it's easy to insert into the styrofoam ball that we'll use as a base. You want to cut the branch at an angle so that it goes cleanly into the styrofoam ball. I'm using a 5-inch diameter styrofoam ball, and I'm just going to push that branch right into the center of the ball. And that's all there is to it to prepare for that step. You now have your form and all the roses cut out to make 100 little flowers. We're going to use a quilling tool to twist these shapes into little posies. The quilling tool has a little slit at the tip of it, and you'll put the tiny portion of the posy into it and begin to twist. Take your time. At first it might be a little bit tricky to get that tip in just the right spot, but once you get the hang of it, these little flowers go really quick. I'm going to show you at different angles. You just twist slowly, keeping that coil tight as you go in the center, and using your hand and your thumb to feed things along. As you get further out, the coil becomes a little bit looser and the flower opens up just a little bit, but the center stays tight. Once you've coiled it as far as it can go, you're going to gently pull the tool off and you'll have your little posy. To keep it from uncoiling, I'm going to use hot glue to hold everything in place. I'll gently bend the posy open and squeeze a small amount of hot glue right at the base, and then push the posy back into it, and that will hold everything together. You just need to press that for about 2 or 3 seconds. Careful, don't burn your fingers. And it's set and ready to be used for the project. If the glue hasn't quite set, use your finger to push down in the middle just to hold everything in place until the glue has dried. You'll continue making the roses one by one, setting them aside for the project. Remember, you have to make 100 roses. Depending on how tightly you coil the rose will be bigger or smaller. and you should try different shades of cardstock to make the topiary more interesting. Here's the fun part. We're going to glue on the roses. Again, I'm going to use a hot glue gun to accomplish this. I'm going to use the trunk topiary as a handle, and I'll turn the topiary as necessary when applying the roses. I have all my roses set out, different sizes and shapes, some of the small pinwheel roses, some of the scallop posies, some of the large pinwheel posies, all ready to assemble on the ball. It's helpful to have this all set up right near your work area so that you can put the roses on before the hot glue has set up. And you'll just begin assembling things one at a time. I want you to remember to vary the sizes and shapes of the roses as you add them to the ball. Try not to put the exact same kind of rose next to each other. This will keep your project from looking too planned out. Now you'll want to figure out how much glue you can put on at a time. For my heat gun, I know I can put 1 or 2 squirts, which is about an inch, maybe 2 inches worth of glue at a time, before it starts to cool off and the paper roses won't stick to it. So I just want to cover a 2-inch strip with glue, keeping my project close to all the roses that I'm going to be using so that I can immediately put those roses onto the ball and have them set. I'm tucking smaller roses into areas next to larger roses to fill in the cracks. Don't worry too much if you don't fill in every single little space. By the time that you get 100 roses on the ball, it'll look really nice, even if there's a few open areas. You'll notice as you're gluing the roses on, you have the opportunity to tuck them underneath the row below it. You can see that there's an edge to the roses that's a little bit wide, and that tucks in nicely under the previous roses, and that helps fill up the spaces as well. Again, I'm just turning using that handle to keep the project in place. The paper roses are pretty sturdy. I don't think you can bend them too badly, and if you did, you can just bend them back into place. But using that handle to manipulate your project makes it a little bit easier. The area at the top of the topiary will be the most visible, so you'll want to make sure that you'll cluster the roses nicely. This wasn't as important in the bottom portion of the topiary, but the top portion is easier for people to look at. So you'll want to pay particular attention to varying the size, shape, and even color of the roses that you put there. Covering the last few inches of the topiary requires even more planning. Look at the flowers that you have on hand and see how they'll fit into the top portion. You may have to tuck things in a little bit, pressing them underneath other flowers. And the final rose gets tucked into the last open space. You may have to pull one of the flowers out of the way and press it in. Don't worry, it's made of paper. It's quite sturdy. We're now going to prepare the plaster that will hold the trunk in place inside the flower pot. I'm using some plaster of Paris. You'll need a measuring cup, some water, and a stick to stir the plaster. Follow the directions on your plaster of Paris to see what the proportions of water to plaster are. I tend to go a little bit thick because I wanted to set up nicely and really hold the trunk in place while I'm working with the project. I'll put the plaster into a measuring cup, add some water, and then I'll stir it. At first, it'll be very thin. If you haven't worked with plaster before, it's really easy, but you need to watch the consistency carefully. At first, it'll be very thin. Continue to stir, making sure that everything is evenly dissolved. It always surprises me how quickly it goes from thin to thick in just a matter of seconds, so keep your eye on it. Once the plaster has achieved the consistency of cupcake frosting, you can begin scooping it into the pot. I already have the topiary sitting in my flower pot, and I'm just putting the plaster in around it. Don't worry if you get a little bit of plaster on the topiary or the pot. It comes off quite easily. You can clean it up before everything's dry. I'm going to use the stick to tuck the plaster in around the topiary, and you can see it's so thick it holds the topiary almost immediately. Scoop a little bit of extra plaster in around the topiary, using the sides of the pot to help scrape the plaster off. Again, it'll be easy to clean things up, so just focus on adding plaster around the base of the topiary and you can smooth it out later. Don't worry if the plaster looks uneven inside the pot. Use a damp washcloth to clean any plaster off the trunk or the pot before it sets up. The final step is to cover the plaster with some moss. In the Pacific Northwest, I have plenty of moss growing in my backyard. So I carefully picked out some nice bright green pieces of moss, and I used that to hide the plaster. I hope you liked today's project, and please join me again next time.